minute or two late here. Just give me another moment to finish getting set up. I'll blame it on our AD. That's not really fair. Anyway, I was actually off just syncing and coordinating with our AD here as we transition from Pete to Barry. To make sure that we had everything under control.
You have to be careful about which meaning of syncing you're talking about, of course.
About
syncing.
Oh, yes.
Just saying.
Okay. So this is the meeting that we're in. I'm going to hand out the blue sheets. And Jabberscribe and minutes taker. Alexander now volunteered for minutes. Do we have anyone who's willing to be a Jabberscribe? And I'm not going to be able to do it up here, so because I'm going to be running just a couple of slides here. And Wes, excellent, thank you. Okay. Let me just take a breath here and now that I'm sitting down. That's right, it's Friday welcome. Certainly do appreciate everyone, sticking around long enough to be here. I know we have a few key people who were not able to, stick around for the week and finish up here, including my co-chair, Antoine Verschuren. But he is here in spirit with us. So, EPP extensions, this is the agenda that I had proposed for here. So, our first opportunity, of course, is for agenda bashing. Anyone have any suggestions or changes to or comments about the agenda? So, we'll take a quick moment here and put the requisite note well up here, which basically just means that you're here, so the IETF owns you. If you have any questions or concerns about that, there's a few RFCs that you should check and make sure that you're comfortable with all of that. So, well, we've had one big success story here, so thank you to everyone, and especially to Scott. He's the author of this document and certainly worked the process and pressed us along to make this happen. So we have our registry, which exists, and there's the pointer. And I thought we would just take a moment just to remind us about the purpose of this registry, a couple of key points about the way that it works. We've settled on the idea that this is really a very open and broad registry. The only requirement is that a specification exists. And it's important to keep in mind that that specification doesn't even have to exist within the IETF context, so it certainly does not have to be an internet draft or published as an informational RFC. That's not a requirement here. The actual specification can exist in any publicly accessible location. And we do have a list of technical experts led by Scott Hollenbeck. And Scott can correct me if I say this wrong or if he'd prefer to say it a little bit differently. But the important thing to keep in mind that the only role of these technical experts is just to ensure that any specification that tries to get into the registry is self-consistent, that it makes sense, that there's no obvious glaring concern with this document. The important thing there is that these experts are not in a position to reject any registration in the registry. I mean, it really has to be a significant concern and an issue. The technical experts will use the mailing list that we have. The EPP extensions mailing list will be used for all of its discussions and dialogue. So anything that they're doing, any comments that they make will be transparent and open, seen by everybody. The experts may interact with the authors and try to make suggestions, suggest the document for whatever basis that they want to do. But in the end, in general, anything that comes to the registry would ordinarily, the bias is in favor of publication, unless there's some very obvious and a glaring reason to reject it. and there'll be some discussion on the list if that were ever to be the case. So I think that's all there is to say about that. Any questions or comments? Scott, you want to add something?
Sure. Scott Holland back here. The only thing I'd like to add is that we are currently looking at 18 extension requests that were submitted by Jim Gould from VeriSign. The way we're going to do this, given the number, is that we've assigned 2 experts per document so that everyone will be reviewing 6 documents. The experts know that we've got about a 2-week window of opportunity to share our comments before IANA will start asking questions. And so that's the process we're going to follow. The review comments will be posted to the list, and once we've got all the opinions weighed, I'll get back to IANA with a thumbs up to let them all go through.
So, thank you, Scott. Okay, next item on the agenda, the other documents that came into this group, and what is our status and where are we going to go? So this is my summary of each of these documents. So I'll just quickly state what they are, and then really would like to see if we have any discussion from this group, if there's any more discussion to be had about where to go. The EPP, the key relay document, is the one which has been getting the most discussion on the mailing list, especially recently. I know that the authors were asking for it to be a standards track document, but there's a fair amount of discussion about whether or not that document really is in an appropriate form for standards track. Still some discussion going on about the use of some of the verbs, how it integrates with EPP, and whether it aligns with what we understand, the EPP architectural model to be. And I think that those all have to be resolved before the document goes forward. Depending on how that resolves, there might be some changes that have to happen in the document. So I don't think we're ready to move that one along, unless the authors want to instead switch to it being informational, in which case, the document could go as is because it represents what they're actually doing and what they've deployed, and it certainly meets the requirements for inclusion in the registry. I'm sorry. You're right. Thank you for that, Alexander. You're right. In terms of process and in terms of formality, it really should go for working group last call, just because it's in this working group under this charter and the way it is, the way this working group was formed to deal with these documents. So if you want informational, it could go to working group last call for that and then move along. And Scott is standing at the mic, so.
Yes, Scott Holland back again. I just do want to remind everyone that the last note on the mailing list from Rick Rivers, one of the authors, was that the authors had decided to revise the approach that's currently in the document, and they were going to modify the approach to use one that Jim Gould had suggested. So I think they've already made the decision that they're not interested in publication as informational, and they are interested in revising it for it to be a good candidate for a standards track document.
So good, thank you for that. So when we see the new document, we'll do another review and we'll see where we are. Okay. Moving on to the launch phase document, there was one discussion about an errant comma at one point in the specification. At some level, it's a minor editorial thing. Oh, I'm sorry, that's just my, I should get rid of this, then we won't have that problem. Okay, which is sounds like an editorial thing, but it does change an interpretation. And maybe Jim, do you want to come up and say a word more about that?
Yes, I really don't have any issue with adding the comma. I think it's kind of a nit feedback. I believe that we'll be getting more of those kinds of things as it goes through the process. So the question is whether or not that requires a new version of the draft, and we have no problem with publishing a new version with the comma in there. But there's one other item that was sent to me privately, was to include one additional implementation status from one of the other parties that I could include in there if there is a need to republish for this. But I've already requested for working group last call, so the question is it ready post this or prior to this?
Alex Mayover, I believe so many versions of this document in various names have been, two names have been around that we could probably working group last call it together with the SMD draft. I think it's pretty stable and there are implementations out there, so go and get it published.
Right. So thank you for that. I mean, I do believe that this document is ready for working group last call. I think I would like to see the iteration, see the revision, and get an 05 with that comma in there. I'm neutral on the implementation issue and whether or not that should be in the document or not. You know, it wasn't put to the list. No one's had a chance to comment on it. I don't know if anyone else feels strongly about it.
Yeah, this is Jim Gould. That was an action item from the last IETF, was to include the implementation status information to help with the ISG review. We've gotten, I think it was about 5 or 6 responses from the list for that we've included in the latest version of the draft. So the question is whether or not it's necessary to add yet another one. So I just want to open that up as a possibility if we are going to publish a new one. You have to, I mean, put it this way, if we might have enough as it is, but I have no problem with adding additional input into that.
So I guess what I would suggest is as long as we're going to rev the document anyway to put the comma in there, you might as well add it and put it there. It's not a substantive change, so let's do that. That information would normally be included with the when the document shepherd you know, writes up the document, and because they indicate implementation status and they call that out in that write-up. So it might as well be complete. We have the information. I would suggest doing it. So for this particular document, I'm prepared to simply do a working group last call as soon as version 5 appears. And I think that we can make that a fairly speedy working group last call. We'll test this out on the mailing list, but I would think a week would be enough time, just enough time to give a document shepherd some time to prepare what they have to do so that that's ready to go. And then it can go out the door and be done. So that would be good. If no one objects, we'll check that on the mailing list, but I'm not imagining we'll have any objections. Next one is the TMCH SMD document. Hasn't been too much discussion here. I think this is a stable document. I think that it's ready for working group last call. And unless anyone wants to object, I suggest that we simply start that on this document as soon as I can do that on the mailing list. I don't think the authors have asked for it, but I think it's appropriate to declare that that's the right thing to do at this point.
Yes, this is Jim Gould. He did ask for it on the last message to the list. Just take a look at it. I believe that he had revved it, and I believe that he had asked for working group last call on it. But I support it in any way.
This is Francisco Arias. So channeling Gustavo, yes, he has requested this to be put for last call.
Okay. So that takes care of those documents. And then the last one is the IDN map document. This one has had the least amount of discussion on our list. And I'm also struck by the fact that the document currently says that they're looking for experimental status. That's what it actually says in the document itself. So I mean, even speaking as working group chair, I really don't know precisely where to go with this document, in part because of so little discussion. I mean, I can make some suggestions, and I have some comments from a process point of view about it being experimental or not, but I'd like to see if we can get any discussion here about this document and its status and what we should do with it.
Yes, this is Jim Gould. Based on my discussions that I had with the authors of this draft, and there was a lot of discussion earlier on, specifically with me, around this one, which led to the IDN table draft that was posted. But I believe, and I'll let the authors speak to this, though, that I believe their intent was for it to go standards track, although I'm not sure why it would call experimental, so.
Alex Mayover. I would suggest, since there was so little discussion and the group is quite small, that we think about assigning like 5 or 6 reviewers that specifically review the document before we progress it. Regarding experimental or not, I don't have any opinion at that point in time.
Okay, so I heard two things. One was Jim suggesting that he thought the authors really wanted standards track, so maybe this is just an anomalous wrong checkbox when the document was submitted or something, and that's fine. If you look in the tools and the actual document, that's what it says as its intended status. That's why I was struck by that.
Yes, Jim Gould again. Actually, I think that this came up at the last IETF, and we'd have to take a look at the meeting minutes on that, because I believe as we were going up, talking about each one of these drafts, each person was describing whether or not what the intent was, and I believe they had said that they wanted it standards track. So we'll just have to double check.
And I thought I heard, Alexander, you were suggesting explicitly getting designated people to review it so that we know that we have some actual documentation here. And I think that's a good thing, especially if we are going to go standard track. It is important to have some kind of discussion on the list and at least some people to acknowledge that they want to support the document and move it forward. You know, and this is why I was just, from a process point of view, concerned as chair. I just felt like this document hadn't really had enough discussion in that regard. So we'll have to look to the list and see if we can get a few volunteers to acknowledge their support for this draft. Do we know about implementation? I'm looking at Jim and he's shaking his head no, but.
Yeah, that's Jim Gould. Yeah, I recommend that they add an implementation status section just like we did with the other drafts. We personally have not implemented it. We have our own custom extension that we would like to migrate over to it once we can do the IDN table as well.
Okay. Yeah, I know that we haven't implemented this either, so okay. So what I'm going to hear as an action here is two things. We should reach out to the authors to have them to indicate some implementation status in the document so that that's clear as we move this thing forward. And we need to get some volunteers on the mailing list to indicate their support for this document moving on to the standards track. And we'll see if we can get, I'm just going to pick a number and say 3. 3 sound like a good number? I'll ask for that on the list too. 5. Alexander's saying 5. I know that's what DNSOP used to do. Used to require 5 people to acknowledge a draft before they'd move it forward. I'm not opposed to that. I mean, we'll bring it to the list and press on that idea. I mean, I think there are certainly 5 people who we could get, you know, who we should be able to get to read this. It's not that long a document. It's not that difficult. Alexander?
Could we get volunteers right now? Because I would happily review it. Yeah. And if we get the 5 names right now, then, you know, people have long flights back home, and so it's likely that reviews would come home on Monday.
Look for volunteers. All right, so we have 1 with Alexander.
Yes, Jim Gould. I've actually reviewed it, and most of my discussions were based on that review, so I could volunteer since I've already reviewed it.
We have Scott. So Scott Hollenbeck also raised his hand, and Jim Gould. And Jeff. Yeah, he raised his hand again. You got him? Okay. I'll add my name to the list too, and I think that gets us 5.
Scott Hollenbeck here. For what it's worth, if you are a designated expert for reviewing extensions, you should not even have to be asked if you're going to be reviewing these documents. Okay? Those that are on the standards track, you'll not be asked by IANA after the fact, but that means the assumption is that you are reviewing them before they get to IANA.
Very good point. Thank you for that. Don't get to say no anyway. Okay. So those were the 4 documents. about which this working group was chartered with originally. And so, I mean, this is good. We're on track here to move these along. And I think that takes care of that. We'll bring, final decisions to the mailing list because we do have a couple of key people who aren't here, but I think we're all in agreement about where to go with these things. So, okay. Other topics that I wanted to open the door for that would be relevant to this working group and talking about would of course be we had a registrations operation workshop. It's not, it certainly was not an IETF event per se, but it is certainly relevant to this group. And I could say something myself, but I wondered, Scott, if you might want to just give a little summary for this group about that, put you on the spot. I did not prepare you in advance, but...
Oh, that's okay. This is Scott Hollenbeck. It's a topic I know well. I certainly don't mind talking to it. I did post a summary of the workshop to the RegOps mailing list, and if any of you are not on that list, it's probably one worth getting on. It's regops@nlnetlabs.nl, right?
Yes.
And they use Mailman, so if you just poke around a little bit, it shouldn't be too hard to find subscription information. The first part of the workshop was explicitly focused on EPP extension activities. So I did an introduction of the new registry, the registration process, what the role of the designated experts are, and then Jim Gould registered the first of 18 extensions, to demonstrate that registering an extension is as easy as filling out an email template and shooting it off to IANA. Excuse me. So that part was really pretty easy. We had a number of EPP extension discussion topics, which for the most part we deferred, lots and lots of, well, what happens in the IETF types of discussion to today. The workshop is not a replacement for the working group. Think of it as a group of interested people who are, want to see this work going forward, and so I plan that there should be some more discussion after, maybe when I'm done talking here. The other thing, though, that was kind of interesting is we also opened up the door to a couple of non-EPP topics because there's more to registration operations than domain names. Olafur Gudmundsson and Jacques Latour from Sierra, Olafur's from Cloudflare. Olafur's been banging the drum about the role of DNS hosting providers in this ecosystem. And so we gave those two guys a little bit of time to talk about the kinds of things that they're looking for. And what it boils down to is that the current ICANN SRS model is typically a registry to registrar relationship. As a hosting provider, Olafur's been saying, I have to work through a registrar to make changes to delegations and to deal with anything having to do with, my customers and my services. And so he has been, trying to see if there's interest in DNS hosting providers specifically becoming a playing member of the ecosystem that would have direct access to the registries to do the things they need to do. So we talked about that for a little bit. The other thing we talked about, Richard Barnes from Mozilla introduced the Let's Encrypt initiative and the ACME protocol. And you might be wondering, well, what does that have to do with domain names? Well, it's about publishing information in the DNS, right? Let's Encrypt, they do believe that there is an opportunity and a relationship to some work in DANE. DANE uses the DNS to deliver its information, and so I thought this might be something of interest to this community. The other thing we spent a little bit of time talking about as well, do we want to continue doing this? What might we talk about next? There was general agreement that we wanted to do another workshop in advance of the IETF meeting in Prague. Topics are TBD, but it did seem like that there were two that seemed kind of prominent or possible. One was RDAP, the Registration Data Access Protocol. And if you haven't been following the work of the WEIRDS working group, you should. Even though actually it's been closed, I'm sorry. So now you have to go looking for the work that they did do. But anyway, WEIRDS produced a protocol called RDAP, yet another candidate replacement for WHOIS. But this one might actually have some traction in that the RIRs in particular are already running it. And there's contractual language in the contracts for the ICANN licensed registries to implement it and run it after certain conditions are met. It's a lot lighter weight, a lot easier to implement than some of the other candidates that were discussed and proposed over time. So anyway, this one I think is going to get some traction. And I wanted to suggest that we have a workshop to start thinking about what operations and operational parameters look like before the policy people start making decisions about how this should work in the absence of real operational experience. So that was one topic, and the whole role of service providers in the registration ecosystem was another. Continued discussion on the RegOps mailing list. So if you're interested in following along and participating in that, please get on that list and please join in the discussion.
So thank you for that. And I do think this is an important workshop, and it's turning out to be pretty successful. We're really getting, the right people to come into this group and really talk about some of these technical issues. And, we'll be talking about some of the extensions that will come through this group too. So it's a good thing. I would encourage people to subscribe to RegOps and make your own decision about how involved you're going to be and engage with this stuff, and pay attention to the workshop. What I meant here by topics brought forward when I put it on here is one of the things, there was a set of some EPP extensions that were talked about. They do exist as internet drafts, and so there's the possibility that they might be interesting documents that would come to this group for a look at creating IETF standards. So we'll get to that on the next slide. I want to, I think, just use this as a mark point here and just say that I think from the point of view of this working group and our current charter, this is our, the set of topics that we just talked about and finished, and having gotten to the end of this slide in the registration workshop, that's been the work of this working group. I think our future here is, under our current charter, is not especially long and fairly short-lived. And in fact, I would not expect for this group under its current charter to meet in Prague. Ideally, the documents that we have look like they're pretty well under control and very close to being ready. A couple of them actually are right on track for working group last call, with measured in days here, so we can move them along. So that's our current expectation. So that brings us to the next possible topic of, do we want to, or more precisely, is there a need for us to recharter and be available to do future work, and what that future work might be. So going back to the registry and its existence that's been published, I think that there is a singular purpose that this working group could serve, or a recharted version of this working group could serve, in terms of its relationship with the extension registry that's out there. And that is, for any extension that seeks to be an internet standard and be published as a proposed standard, as opposed to just being documented, this working group could provide a home with the participants that we have for reviewing those documents and giving them the technical depth of review that they need and would ordinarily be required, and give us an opportunity to examine implementation experience and talk about that too. What I did here was go find a few of the documents that have been talked about. I think I've got everything here, but there's at least 4. I think it occurs to me now that I might have missed one. But in any case, we do have some candidates that could easily be brought in here, if these authors are interested in doing that. There has already been some discussion on the mailing list about Gavin Brown's EPP fees document. He had submitted it just to the registry, but there's been some discussion on the mailing list about making that standard track and making it a standard. And I see, at least from the mailing list, some agreement among those participating there that we'd like to see Gavin do that. I have not talked myself to Gavin about whether he would be willing to do that with his document. He has not said anything on the mailing list in particular about that. It looks like Jim wants to come up and speak to that issue.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up, well, one thing was the fact that the extensions that are being registered into the registry, I'm hoping that the experts that are reviewing it will see overlap and potential for coming up with proposals in the future to standardize some of these. But with these specific documents and Gavin in particular, he has switched it to the track be standards track in the last published version of the draft. And I believe that is his intent, but it would be good for him to say that explicitly. But I would support it to go and be included in the rechartered working group. And one of the drafts that's missing here is the IDN table draft.
That's right, the IDN table, yeah.
And as far as the drafts that I'm involved with, including the change pool, allocation token, and the IDN table, I would like those included in a rechartering of the working group.
The IDN, just one moment. So the IDN table is your document, right? I'm trying to type the name up here.
Yes, it's Gould IDN. I'm not sure if there's a dash between IDN and table, but that's close enough. And that was done with the co-authors of the IDN map extension that's currently in the charter.
Go ahead.
Just probably Virginie. Well, I'm just wondering, it looks like we're kind of looking at two kind of documents here for describing extensions. Some of them are probably intended to be standard tracks because they will be probably implemented by multiple registries in the future, so they're kind of base blocks for the future, while some others, like Wilcox, are basically just describing the state of the world, and my understanding was that these would be only used as a baseline to see where the overlaps are. So would we make that second category standard track actually? It doesn't seem to make sense to me. It would be better informational, right?
Okay, so let me focus this discussion in this way and answer your question. The question I want to put to the working group here today is whether or not we believe that we should recharter and that there will be work to do. Okay, these were just examples of potential documents that we might consider pulling in and adopting. So let me take a moment to talk about what I would expect in the way this working group would work as compared to how the registry works. Okay, and just put this out there for discussion. The goal of the recharted working group would be to only examine extensions that want to be on the standards track. But getting to one of the points that you just asked about, Jeff, one of the other things that I would expect to happen is as this registry becomes used and more extensions get listed there, we expect that there's going to be some amount of overlap that will appear, and I would expect that individuals, beginning with the technical experts who review these extensions, would actually propose to the working group that it might consider examining a particular technical issue that it sees out there. And of course, we would have to work with the authors of these documents to see if we could interest them in bringing it to the working group. So it wouldn't be the working group that would have the job of reaching out to pull work items in, but people would have to propose that and bring them in that way, or authors would elect to bring them to the working group. And it looks like Wes wants to channel something in the Jabber room.
That's correct. This is Wes Hardiker channeling YAO is the handle. When recharter, EPPX for bundled names registration should be considered. For example, public interest registry requested to implement technical bundling of second-level domains for .ngo and .ong. The basic extensive, the basic extensible provisioning protocol, EPP domain name mapping, RFC 5731 provides the domain name I think he's quoting something from an RFC, provides the domain name registration one by one. It does not specify how to register the bundled domain names which share the same attributes.
So thank you for that. Yes, that's just another candidate document for the new working group to adopt. And Jim, please go ahead.
Yes, Jim Gould. With some of the extensions that we just recently registered, although we didn't create them as internet drafts, I think there will be some overlap with some of these other drafts that may be discussed in this group. Like, for example, the bundling, we have a related domain extension that may be of interest. So the question is whether or not, if some of these are informational drafts, and that if there's overlap and interest in working at a consolidated standard, it might make sense to try to merge some of these together.
So, again, let me try to be specific here about at least my suggestion for how this process would work. There's nothing to prevent, any extension from being documented on the registry, and it's important to keep that in mind. There will be individuals who will want to seek to get their documents onto the standards track, and so they will bring them to this potentially new working group, this recharted working group, and ask to have them reviewed and considered on the standards track. And separate from that, anytime there's overlap that's observed on the registry, anyone would be in a position to propose to the working group that we should reach out to these authors and see if we can't get those multiple authors and their multiple documents to be willing to come together to, merge them and create a single documented standard for doing that work. I mean, it's in all of our best interests to create a single way of doing things rather than having multiple versions. So, before I ask my question again, Jim, comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, I believe this follows up on that discussion about the IDN EPP extension that's here from Wilcox. I don't believe the intent was for that to be standards track, I think as was discussed previously. And if there is intention for that to be brought up by the working group, I would really want to have that merge in with, like I said, the extension that we may have or others may have on that. So it might be, that topic might be good for the working group, but I just wouldn't support that draft as being the basis.
And Jeff?
Jeff Tonley. I do agree for those that will be standard tracks, but do we, again, want to be the risk charter work group to be a vehicle for RFCs, informational RFCs that would just host what has been done in the past? Whatever, they might overlap or not, it wouldn't matter. It would just be snapshots of what some registries have done in the past. And it doesn't matter if they are standard track or not, they're just there as a snapshot of past implementation, basically. Do we want to do that in the risk charter group?
And I would say no. Again, I want to carefully focus. The purpose of this working group is only to discuss extensions that are to go onto the standard track.
And this is Barry. I will add as AD, that's what the independent stream is for. That's what the independent stream is for.
So the only question really that I wanted to ask of this group, and we'll have to take this to the list because, again, we do have a couple of key people who are missing, but I think based on my private discussions with a variety of people, we have general agreement about this. And I know that we have the support of our AD as long as there are people who are willing to continue this work, that it would be a good thing to recharter this group and give it the singular purpose of reviewing extensions that are destined for the standards track. We wouldn't necessarily have to make a decision right now. I don't think we have to create the charter with documents in mind, right? I mean, they don't have to be listed in the charter right away. Just have a defined scope for what we're doing. Say again, I'm sorry, Alex. So Barry said yes, he agreed with me. But
I said yes, and Alexander said we just put them in the milestones. Yeah, that's absolutely correct. The charter says what you're going to do in general, and the milestones say what documents you're going to deal with and when they're due.
So we can have some discussion on the list about picking documents as part of also proposing the charter that we're going to use, and we can do that. Now, as a bit of a transition discussion, one of the things which I did talk to our AD about and I've not talked to anyone else in the working group about, so I'm going to put this out there now to see what folks think. But we do have the one, we have 4 documents in our working group right now, 3 of which I think we're going to move along pretty quickly right away. It's not clear yet to me, at least as working group chair, what the status is of the key relay document. Maybe it will fall into the fast track category also when the revision comes out, and so that would be good. But one of the things that I had proposed to our AD is, would it be okay if we went through the rechartering and we simply brought that one document forward? If it's not on the fast track yet, we would bring it forward into this new working group with this new charter, if it's going to stay on the standards track. That just provides a demarc point in the life of this working group versus the new one. And Alexander.
Alexander Mayhofer. First off, I don't understand what the fast track would be.
I just made up that term. What
Okay.
I meant was just that we're coming to closure. We're going to finish them before we actually
It would
end.
be an interesting new document track. I would
Yeah.
definitely be
No.
interested in that. Anyways, I think
Sorry
that
for the confusion.
if we consider a charter that says that the working group will, well, previously said, work on documents of specifying EPP extensions that are on standards track, then that would actually include the relay document as, according to Jim, in the new revision, where the author said, no, we are not going for informational, so we're going to revise it. So essentially, I think that the charter could simply state the working group is chartered to work on EPP extensions that have the goal of being a standards track document. And
Yes.
that's about it. It could be a 2-line charter.
Yes.
And put everything else into the milestones, and we can adapt the milestones on every meeting. Yeah.
That's the intent.
Yeah, let's make a goal of setting a record for the shortest charter, the fewest words in a charter.
Okay. So the other critical thing to talk about with any working group is what its lifetime is likely to be. And so this again was a topic which Barry and I had talked about. He had pressed me on this question, and I will now expose to the working group the response that I gave him in this category. To the extent that the registry of extensions really is going to live forever, you know, one could, it always has the concern that this working group could be very long-lived and live forever too. But of course, we really don't want to do that. And so the response that I had given to Barry, and I had kind of talked a little bit about this issue with a few other people, but not the issue of a lifetime of the working group, there's a certain expectation that there'll be a number of extensions that are going to appear over the next year or so, next couple of years. So we're expecting a fair amount of activity here in the near term. And what I had suggested was, I think that there'll come a time when that pipeline, you know, kind of ends, when suddenly nothing new is going to appear and we'll be finishing up what we're doing. Or maybe there'll just be one item left in the pipeline or something. There'll be I suggested that there would be a fairly obvious time when clearly our workload is shrinking and it's, you know, there's nothing, doesn't look like there's anything significant coming. And it seemed to me that that would be a good time, and we'll have to watch that ourselves. I'm sure the AD is going to watch it with us, and we could just subjectively decide that, you know, now is a good time, let's end this working group. And then what the IETF would do going forward is when somebody wants a new extension to go onto the standards track, they'll try to do quick, you know, one-off working groups to deal with that one extension as they happen. Or, you know, if you get a package of them together, we could do them together. And Barry, please.
And I would intend to reuse this working group's mailing list for it, so it's basically we are reconstituting this working group. The only reason I want to do it that way, rather, the other option is to leave the working group in a sleeping state until the documents come and then wake it up. And the problem is it becomes hard to wake working groups up without going through a chartering process to remind people that they need to pay attention.
Jeff.
Jeff Tremblay. So what's an objective way to evaluate if we've reached that point where we should close down?
I don't think it needs to be objective, say that.
Okay. Barry just said it doesn't need to be objective, but Well, personally, I've seen several work groups in the past going zombie, semi-alive for some time because some people in the group actually thought that it was finished, some others thought that they wanted to get one or two documents more out of the door. Personally, I'd be in favor of putting a deadline, say 2 years, and say if we need to, we might recharter about that after that or close it. I mean, it's dangerous sometimes to put a deadline, but I think 2 years is reasonable. It's that or the zombie possibility. I mean, that possibility is real, I think.
This is Barry. Would you object to having that not be in the charter, but rather be a milestone that we put in afterwards, which we could then change without getting the whole IESG involved if we wanted to?
Good idea.
Okay. So let's include that in the minutes, that one particular point, and we'll make sure that that gets aired on the mailing list and see if there's any other discussion about it. But that seems reasonable to me too, unless anyone wants to object or suggest something different. Okay. Any other discussion about rechartering? So the actions that I would propose from this point is that on this particular topic, I'll pause. Wes wants to channel somebody.
From Ning Kong. Jim, I remember that after I presented the EPP extension of Prevera on the Row meeting, you suggested that this extension should be a standards track document and be discussed in the EPPX working group. So I wonder if I read a draft on this topic later, the EPPX working group is, if it is rechartered, may adopt it or not?
Yes, it would be a candidate for adoption, Ning. So yes, thank you for that. The door, I mean, basically rechartering, the intent is to simply open the door, and anybody who has a documented extension, you're welcome to bring it to the group, and the group will then have a discussion about the standards track opportunity for the document and make sure that we get agreement. We'll be looking, I mean, all of the normal IETF requirements and process would come to bear on it at that point. I mean, you get broad technical review with a large part of the community, be looking for implementations, that kind of thing, interoperability. I mean, all the usual kinds of things one would expect would have to get handled. And actually, I should probably emphasize that a little bit, because one of the things we want to be careful of is that we really do want to make sure that we focus only on standards track documents. That's the goal of this working group, because the goal of this proposed new working group, we don't want to conflict with this registry that's out there. We've already agreed that the registry is there for people to document whatever they're doing, and that's a fine way to proceed. So it's always true that they have to really want it to be on the standards track to bring it to the working group. We don't want to find ourselves in a place where people are just trying to toss it into the working group to see what would happen, and then just have it be bounced out. I mean, if you bring it to the working group, it should be a commitment to want to standardize it, because we'll all commit resources to it. And we want to be fair about that too, and make sure that people understand that. If you just want to document it, don't bring it to the working group just to get documentation and free review. Go ahead, Alexander.
Alex Mauver. As the former working group chair of a very small working group, looking in the room, I'm a little bit concerned about the volume, the number of people in the room, because, I mean, we have like 20 people now. About 10 of them are probably reading email. So it boils down to essentially a couple of individuals who are going to do the work. So it would be one of the interesting things would be to keep the traction in that working group over the next 2 years if we want to continue that. And I see a major point would be to actually get people from the registrar side involved into the IETF work, which is hard, because they usually not go to IETF meetings. But I can see that we're probably down to like 10 people in a year from now, and that would be a problem.
I mean, I think that's also one of those subjective criteria that we will keep in mind when it comes time to think about whether to continue the working group or not. And then maybe it's time to spin it down and deal with documents on an individual basis. This particular issue, I mean, EPP in general and all things EPP related, I mean, fundamentally there are at least two, industry partners, if you will, that have to be part of this process, registries and registrars. I mean, we do have a number of significant registries here today. We have, and there are others on the mailing list. So I think we're actually fortunate in that we seem to have the registry community reasonably engaged, depending on how you want to judge numbers. I mean, you know, the fact that we have half a dozen of us around is not much of a comparison when you look at the number of service providers that are out there now. But in terms of registrars, it's always been problematic, and we know that. I think the workshop that actually, you know, VeriSign had, you know, pushed on this first time around, it's really going to become more of a community thing. We've got GoDaddy in particular, you know, probably the most significant registrar engaged, and they're actively involved. And I know that Roger Carney was here earlier when the meeting started. He waved to me from the back of the room as he was leaving. He had an early flight out, so he couldn't stay till the end. But he is engaged, and actively so. And I know that all of us, there are a few of us registries who are going to do our part here going forward to try and bring more registrars in. And we would obviously encourage more people to do that. We're hoping that as we start to show some successes, we'll actually start to see more people interested too. So, you know, and it's hard to say, but that's an important evaluation criteria for all of our documents. I think as we go standards track, as a working group, we have to manage that too. Make sure that we have evaluation by a few key people. And Federico wants to come to the mic.
I would like to make a comment regarding the NING document, the purveyor document. It's basically resellers document. I think this is a really important document because I would like to make a comment here regarding the Brazilian market. Because of the policy developments inside of ICANN, there is a lot of registrars these days that are starting to withdraw from agreements with ICANN and become resellers, especially in our market. So this is definitely very important work that we should standardize.
So thank you for that. Ed?
Ed Lewis. I'm going to make a comment I'll probably regret making. You're talking, what you were talking about, not Ning's comment, what you were talking about before. Who's engaged in this? And this is actually the first time I actually came to EPP-EXT meeting. And I haven't read a lot of the history, but I have a general idea what's going on in the group. But there's possibility that this might begin to apply to DNS hosting providers to submit DS records. And I'm saying possibly, as I understand what the protocol is all about, but it might be that there's actually a expanded mission for the protocol if we get into the management of the DNS beyond the registrar model that we're so used to thinking about. So I would think about it, although I may regret saying it because maybe it's a bad idea, but I do see possible scope creep for the protocol might come into play.
So the only comment I'll make about that is, and I know that you're aware, Ed, of Oliver's is generally the one who's been evangelizing this, bringing DNS operators as more of an integral part of this registration process. Certainly that is one of the potential solutions, is getting them engaged using EPP as a protocol as part of the process, but there are other ways of doing things, and that's an open question. In the previous slide that I had here where I talked about future topics, you know, the workshops are going to continue to deal with this issue in the large, and at the point in time that they're coming close to a solution, then I would expect that solution to find a home in the IETF in an appropriate way. Whether that's this group or some other group, that remains to be seen. And Francisco, please.
This is Francisco Arias, channeling Francisco Obispo. So he's saying the intention with the ID map draft is to make it standard. He says his intention is to update it and submit it as such. And he's open to discuss potential merging with other drafts like Jim's draft, if that makes sense.
Okay, so thank you for that. Okay, not seeing anyone else at the line, and Wes is not looking up like he wants to channel anybody from the Jabber room. So let me try and restate again. Let me try and just summarize and capture again what I think are the actions from this particular step and the way this is going to work going forward. I sense support in the room that rechartering would be a good thing, and I don't see anyone objecting at the moment, so I'll take that as a positive hum. And we will bring that question to the mailing list just to confirm that we don't have any significant objections on the mailing list. Under the assumption that we go forward, we should have some discussion on the mailing list about what that charter is going to look like. And the chairs will take as an action to make a first proposal on what that would be, get some discussion on the list, and we'll work with our AD to move that forward. And I'll pause here now while Wes channels somebody.
Yeah, sorry, there was confusion as to whether it was supposed to be relayed or not. Lin Zhu said that the purveyor or reseller information is important to both registrars and end users. So there's a big requirement for them to do this extension.
Yes, and thank you for that. That actually was a draft that was discussed at the workshop. It's just purely my interpretation that I didn't sense out of the workshop that that was an immediate candidate for the working group, but that in no way is intended to reflect that it could not be brought to the new working group. So I apologize if there was any implication there. And Francisco.
Yeah, Francisco Arias. In the case of if by reseller you mean having the ability to provide the reseller as a data point to the registry? Is that what
I believe that's what he meant, yes.
Yeah,
I see nodding heads.
Yeah, that's certainly a topic of interest, I believe. In the case of ETLDs, there is an upcoming policy implementation that will require all the ETLDs to provide this information, to have this information, so they will have to request this from registrars. So there is an opportunity for having a standard extension to do this.
Right. So in addition to this nice short list of 5 possible, I think we've gotten another 4 or 5 already as possible candidates for documents to move forward. So I think our assessment earlier that there would suddenly be a great deal of activity here in the short term to move some stuff along is pretty true, and that'll be good. Okay, so quickly, quick recap. We'll ask on the list and confirm there's no objections to rechartering, and we will start a discussion on the list. I'll make a proposal with Antoine for a new charter, and we'll have the discussion that we need to have on the list to move that along. And then as soon as that's complete and we submit it to our AD and it goes through the ISG process, I would expect after that event has occurred, then we come back and maybe our AD will let us overlap this a little bit, but then we get to look at these documents and decide which ones we're going to take in, or look for authors to submit documents for standards is what I should say. We certainly have to agree to review anything that anybody wants to submit as a standards track. We may have to have some discussion about priorities here because we're going to have a whole bunch of documents. I don't think we're going to be doing them all in parallel, but I guess we'll sort that out on the mailing list too. And our AD is at the mic, please.
Yes,
Barry.
absolutely overlap this stuff. Once you and I agree on a charter, just assume it's going to get done and start the work, and we'll check the boxes appropriately.
So in parallel over the next month, I would expect to, wrap up the documents that we have, the 4, and also be talking about our new charter and get that done, so that we can then immediately transition in the May-June timeframe to working on these new documents and moving them along. Okay, and I think that's the assessment there for that. I would expect as long as we've got a series of documents to work with, then that we'll plan to meet in Prague. I'm assuming there'll probably be a set of documents, so we'll have a reason to have a meeting and some future discussion. So, okay, and this actually is my last slide, just a replay of the agenda. So we've covered everything on the agenda, and the last item down there is any other business. If everyone is comfortable, this is just any other business question. Any comments about anything we've talked about, or anything new we should talk about?
This is Jim Gould. One suggestion is to, if you're going to have a meeting in Prague, to make it earlier, potentially have it, closer to when the row meeting may be, so therefore we can get more people to be here in person.
That's a good suggestion. I know that the IETF is good about that. They don't, you don't draw the short straw. all the time. They try. But I know, Barry, that the registration workshop is not really an IETF event, but...
No, we'll try. As I remember, you were on Friday in Honolulu as well, weren't you? You were late in the week sometime. Maybe it wasn't Friday.
Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe it was before. I don't know. You didn't meet in Honolulu?
I thought I don't remember. I'm pretty sure we
I
did.
have a
We did meet in
distinct
Honolulu, but I
recollection
forget
of
when.
trotting over to your meeting in
Yeah.
Honolulu. But in any case, just put in the free-form text, put early in the week preferable, and I'll make sure that happens.
Right. So since I guess that workshop will probably happen on the weekend, if we could get a Monday or Tuesday, that would be great. And Wes?
There's 2+1s in the Jabber room for earlier time slot, please.
Yeah, I know. Everybody likes early time slots for IETF, though.
Actually, knowing in advance, even if it's late in the week like today, would not bad to have the ROA in this afternoon or maybe tomorrow, but not in the middle of the week. That would be bad for people that only will be following this working group and the ROA meeting.
And that's a good point, too. I mean, I guess ROA has to have its own discussion about when it wants to have its meeting. I mean, yeah, if it were to want to try and get the end of the week and on Saturday, that might be interesting.
Well, how much lead time does that need? Because we don't get the agenda out too early. So
Yeah.
if you're trying to coordinate, unless one of the meetings is set fairly early, it's harder to coordinate that.
I think ROA was pretty good this time around to know pretty early on when it was going to be. So I would suspect that it'll probably do the same thing the next time around also.
Okay,
So it'll know when it
when you
is.
make your request, you know when that's going to be, then
Right.
just make the request here appropriately and do what we can.
So we'll do our part to try to make that work. I know, Scott, that you're not actually driving that one the next time around, but maybe we can all just work together to get the scheduling a little better organized.
Yeah, sure. Scott Hollenbeck here. Just the one little bit of feedback I'd like to share is I did an awful lot of polling, in advance of this particular workshop, and the consensus of people who actually said they wanted to attend was that they'd rather do it earlier in the week than later. I think after a long week of fun here, everyone's looking to go home.
Yeah. So, yeah, Frederico's going to come to the mic here.
Scott's completely right, but I met the reasoning of my comment is for us to bring more registrars or people that would not stay for all the IETF week, but would stay for the first day or the last one. So could use the IETF day pass or something for this meeting.
So, I mean, just to be fair to the process here, if you will, we have a desire to want to have our meeting as close to the registration workshop as possible. But we do have to recognize that the registration workshop is not an IETF event. And so, Barry is agreeing to be kind to us as far as that scheduling is concerned, but IETF scheduling is IETF scheduling. We can only ask and hope for the best. So I just want to make sure that gets stated pretty clearly here, so we don't have unintended expectations.
And just to prove that I'm not entirely insane, I just looked at the proceedings from Honolulu, and there are minutes, blue sheets, an audio recording, and so on for this. So I presume we did, in fact, meet in Honolulu.
I was pretty sure we did, but I just can't picture that meeting as uniquely as any other meeting. So, okay. So thank you for that, the scheduling question. Any other business from anyone? Anything in the Jabber room? I'm guessing not. Okay. All right. Then thank you, everyone. We are adjourned, and we'll see you on the mailing list. Oh, blue sheets, stay in the room here. Someone just hold up the blue sheet so I can see where they are. Pass them towards the front, please.
went fairly well.
Yes, yes. No, I mean, I expected it to be short, I actually expected it to be shorter. It turned out to be, that's fine. It's good, we had some good discussions, so that's great.
Input on the charter or trying to get some wording up like a participation sheet.
Well, I think as